Well, it will be the matter of the perfect crime, of the murder of the real, and of the radical illusion, all in the same. Murder of the real, or perfect crime, it resonates a little like Nietzsche's famous phrase proclaiming the death of God. But this symbolic murder of God in the 19th century was going to change the destiny of things. In the perfect crime, it's no longer a question of God, but of reality. And it is no more a symbolic murder, but an extermination. Extermination means exactly the same as for the Nazi extermination camps. There it was physical and radical, whereas here it operates in a literal mode. Extermination means that it passes beyond its own end or its own finality. To exterminate is to propel something beyond its own end so that it no longer has any reason for being or any reason to exist. Extermination means that nothing is left, not even a corpse. The corpse of the real has not been found simply because the real is not dead. It has purely and simply disappeared. Its trace, its body, its corpse cannot be recovered. In a virtual world, the question of the real, of the reference, of a subject, of liberty, can no longer even be posed. All of this refers to Elias Canetti when he says that beyond a certain precise point in time, history has no longer been real. Without realizing it, human existence as a rule suddenly escaped from reality. From that point on, nothing of what happened has been true, but we can in no way have an idea of it. Our task and duty now would be to recover this point, and as long as we cannot do it, go on in the actual way of destruction. What can be said of this blind point of reversal, where nothing is either true or false any longer, and everything floats indiscernibly between cause and effect, between origin and end? Is it reversible or irreversible? Can we move back to this point where the line of history has broken and where we were projected to the other side of the mirror? Who knows? Nobody knows. But by reality, I mean the principle of reality and the whole system of values connected with it. The real as such presupposes an origin, an end, a past, a future, a continuity, a chain of causes and effects, a rationality. No real exists without these elements, and the vanishing of the real is the dislocation of all this configuration, or this constellation. Of course, I anticipate a little. In fact, this perfect extermination could only be achieved if the processes of virtualization were fully realized. Fortunately, it's not the case. As in the best detective novels, the crime is never perfect. Some traces always remain. We are in a situation like Borges' fable of the map and territory. Borges says that nothing more remains but fragments of the map scattered throughout the space of the territory. Now we must invert the phrase and say there is nothing left but a map, in other words, the virtual abstraction of territory, and on this map some fragments of the real are still floating and drifting. Thus, there is no corpse and no victim either. And as for the presumed murderer of this perfect crime, it's a total mystery. The murder can be imputed to anyone. Not any subject of the murder can be identified. I would say that the weapon of a crime is the crime itself. Of this total actualization and volatilization of the real, of this unconditional hyper-realization of the real, there is no class or group or subject to be charged with responsibility. Seemingly irreversible, this process is what we call progress or rationalization of things, simply becoming exponential and in some way chaotic. As for knowing why we go on irreversibly towards this expiration date, we must suppose, for example, that the whole human species has devoted itself to a sort of automatic writing of the world, where the human subject as such disappears. In this automated and operationalized virtual reality, the subject no longer has any functional or critical incidence. It can vanish without the world taking account of it. It becomes a useless function, just as the sex function in clothes. As all traditional functions, subjective, critical, political, sexual, social, economic, moral, become useless in a virtual world. They survive only as emblematic or simulating function, as fake or alibi. Once again, this can be said only by anticipation of a system pushed to the limit. That means that it's not yet realized, but only virtually realized. This process, however, this progress of our technologies seem irreversible, expanding today without constraints, for example, in what is called the information highways, what we could as well call the highways of disinformation, of course. It seems like a huge and irresistible collective compulsion dragging our spaces toward the point of an unconditional realization of reality. We are involved in a gigantic countdown, the finality of which remains unknown, since we have already passed beyond the end. In some way, this is related to what I have called the extreme phenomena. Having reached a point beyond their own end, extreme processes develop by accelerating in a totally imprevisible way and according to catastrophic forms in the sense of phroneton. At this stage, there is no longer any linear unfolding. Everything is precipitated into a turbulence that makes every expectation rationally impossible. All the more impossible, as in a world like our own, where everything becomes visible, must become visible, nothing more is previsible anymore. It's toward this absolute transparency that virtual processes converge. The virtual reality implies a temporal short-circuit that we call time, a form of simultaneity and instantaneity of all things, of global information as well. Such a simultaneity is not without analogy to a kind of perfect crime perpetrated against the time itself, in the sense that time comes by this way to its point of perfection, this instantaneity of all the moments resumed in a single instant. But of course, perfect time has no memory and no future. Let's be clear about this. If the real is disappearing, it's not because we lack of it. On the contrary, there is too much of the real. It's the excess, the overdose of reality that puts an end to reality, the excess of information that puts an end to information, the excess of communication that puts an end to communication. We are no longer dealing with the problematic of lack and alienation, where the subject and the referent were always to be found, and where it was a kind of dialectic of subject and object, supported by strong and active philosophical positions. With the passage to the virtual, something else happened. To be sure, we have always been in a problematic of simulation, but in the problematic of the simulacrum, we can still hear the utopy, the topic and the utopy of reality, of the reference, of something behind or beyond the spectacle. The last and most radical analysis of this problematic was the one of Guy Debord and the situationists, with the development of the notion of a spectacle, of an alienation which still supposed a hidden or occulted reality, and hence the chance of disalienation, of a recovering by the subject of his autonomy and sovereignty. This radical situationist critique is over. I believe that today we have passed into another world. We are no longer in a state where reality is lacking. We are in a state where all that, everything which not so long ago was still alive as ideas, dreams, fantasies, utopias, is fading away, because in the virtual reality nothing more will survive as an idea or as a concept or as a perspective or a future. Everything will be immediately operationalized. You will not even have time enough to imagine. Events, real events, will not even have time to take place. In this context, the good old dialectic of negativity and positivity is over. We are dealing with an attempt to abolish all negativity, to constitute an entirely positive world and perfect world, experts of every illusion, of all sorts of evil, may be exempt from death itself. It is this pure, absolute reality, this unconditional, functional and optimistic realization of the world that I call the perfect crime. This switch into virtual reality can only be conceived as a dimension, as a passage from the dimension of crisis to that of catastrophe. This notion of crisis presupposes a real and historical world with a lot of tensions, contradictions, distortions. We have always been in crisis with the real and the world, but at the end of the 20th century, we are no longer in a state of crisis. We have entered into catastrophic processes. I don't mean catastrophe in the sense of apocalypse or annihilation. A catastrophic process is nothing but the eruption of something that functions according to rules and forms which we don't understand, and maybe we never will be able to understand. Nothing more is simply contradictory or irrational. Everything becomes paradoxical. To pass beyond the end, beyond all finality, is to get in a paradoxical state. This very state of too much reality, too much positivity, too much information, and so on. In this state of paradox, of extreme phenomena, we no longer know exactly what is happening. In any case, we can no longer rely on something like a rehabilitation of the real and the traditional values. If perhaps, after all, the human species is through an enigmatic compulsion doomed to disappear, then it is better, rather than to simply disappear, it's better to exercise the art of disappearance. The humankind being the performer of its own disappearance instead of vanishing without even having the spectacle of it. To face with this paradoxical state of things, we need a paradoxical way of thinking. Since the world drives towards a delirious state of things, we must get a delirious point of view. We need a thought that no longer obeys any principle of truth, of causality, or any discursive form. A thought that knows how to assume poetic singularity, I would say, poetic singularity of events. A thought that accepts the world and its own indecisibility. At this price, thought may become radical. This is not easy. We usually think that holding to the protocols of experimentation and verification is the most difficult, but it's not true. The most difficult is to renounce the truth and the possibility of verification. To hold as long as possible on the enigmatic side, on the contradictory multiplicity of thinking. We are no longer in a world in which things can be resolved by truth. Perhaps we are in a world of poetic resolution, ruled by what I called in the illusion of the end, the poetic reversibility of events. Let's take, for example, the language of classic communication. It tries to signify by discursive means, by inscribing reality in a meaning. But today, such a language is confronted with the hegemonic fantasy of a total and perpetual communication, where digital and extremely simplified languages prevail over the metaphorical richness of natural languages. With digital and binary languages, with coding, deciphering, the very materiality of language and its enigmatic, ambiguous character are erased. We hardly can speak of language anymore. At the absolute limits of complete computation and total cloning of thought, our language as a medium of symbolic exchange would become a useless function. For the first time in history emerged the possibility of a virtual perfect crime against the language, of a total disappearance of the symbolic function. To put it less pessimistic, we must say that what now resists, at the best, this destructive virtualization is the singularity of languages. Singular, irreducible, moving and transforming, languages prove to be of an extreme resistance to the processes of extermination. In this sense, the game is still open, and no one can say who will have the last word. Anyway, and more generally speaking, there is no place at the same time for the world and for its double. The coexistence between a real or a symbolic world, with this total substitution of the world by an artificial, virtual world, identical to itself and perfect, cannot be conceived. It must be a clash between reality and virtuality. An example of this clash is to be found in this story, the fiction story of Arthur Clarke, the story of the 9 billions of names of God. It was a story of Tibetan monks in their mountains. Their task was to count down to describe all the names of God. And at the end, when this work is achieved, that will be the end of the world. Of course, it's a very fastidious work, and the monks are very tired. Then they heard about IBM and the experts of IBM, and they let come the experts of IBM with their computers, and of course, these people achieved the work in 1 month. Yeah. But of course, they don't believe at all in the prophecy of the end of the world. But as they come down the mountain with their computers, they see the stars in the firmament fading away one by one. That is a fiction story, but I read yesterday or the day before in the U.S. Today that in a monastery in New Mexico, monks, a new order of monks, are putting the old documents about the Vatican on the web. Then you see that's a very reality too. Now we come to the crucial point. For, as I spoke of the examination of the real, of the reality, I mean the more and most fundamental examination of illusion. But we must be clear about this concept of illusion. I don't mind the pejorative concept of subjective illusion, of the irrational imagination as principle of falsity, phantasmagory, and evil. The illusion I'm talking about is the radical, objective illusion of the world that resides in this distance separating things from one another, and in this absence of things to themselves or from themselves. Nothing is ever identical to itself. We are never identical to ourselves, except in the sleep or in the death. Language itself never signifies what it means. It always signifies something else. By the very fact of this ontological gap, this absence from itself, the fact of this irreducible distance that makes improbable every relation of the same with the same. A total identification of the world with itself would be the very perfect crime. Fortunately, this never happens. In the relation of things, there is always a hiatus, a distortion, a separation, a rift that forecloses every reduction of the same to the same. And that is the same for human beings. We are never exactly present to ourselves nor to the others. Thus, we are never real, exactly real for one for another, nor each of us for himself. This state of radical alterity is what definitively resists the hegemony and the totalization of the same. By the way, it's also the source of seduction and attraction by the other. Let's transfer this illusion to a cosmic level. Everyone knows that the light of the stars arrives on Earth a long time after. Sometimes the star itself may have already disappeared. This distance between the star and our perception of its light, this non-simultaneity, is part of a very radical illusion of the world. But this irrevocable distortion is positive, for the simultaneous perception of the light of all the stars would be equivalent to an absolute daylight, and this would be for us unlivable. All the energy of life, all our vitality proceeds from this vital illusion, from the fact that nothing is identical to itself. If there were only the same, if the same were identical to the same, we were in an absolute reality, in the unconditional truth of things, but in some way the absolute truth is the other name of death. So illusion is first inscribed in the things themselves, in the world, and not in the consciousness of a subject. Illusion is a general role of the universe, I would say, and reality is but an exception. I do not see, fortunately, any mental or intellectual construction that would neutralize the fantastic, material, and vital illusion by an effect of unconditional truth. It may be illustrated by another topic, the one of the Big Bang. In the history of the formation of the universe, after the Big Bang, a cosmic cooling off occurred that is responsible for the birth of our world. At the moment when things cooled down and materialized, this materialization results in an indissociable pair, both matter and antimatter. But very quickly, matter parted off from antimatter, evolving to our actual world. The materiality of our world, then, is a restricted materiality, unilateral and expurgated of antimatter. This volatilized antimatter forms a kind of invisible, of parallel world of anti-universe about which we know almost nothing, excuse me, and around which all astrophysics gravitates. I call illusion this invisible presence of antimatter, whose power is such that if it came into contact with matter, the interaction of each particle with its corresponding antiparticle would mean an annihilation of matter with the production of pure light. All matter would then be transformed into the radiation of absolute light. But no more science fiction. But the point is that our reality, our objective reality, occurs as a result from the fraction and total amputation of antimatter. This restricted and limited form of matter we call reality. Removed from its antagonistic solidarity with antimatter, the substance of our reality no longer escapes from the second principle of thermodynamics, in other words, from involution and entropy. I find it exciting, at least on the symbolic level, enigmatic and ironic too, that our reality is not the true story, the very clue of the world, but results from a simplification, from a radical reduction of the cosmos itself. Since the objective status of our reality is based on a separation from its other half, we can say that our world is a definitive illusion. The paradoxical result of this scission, of this fracture, is that restricted materiality as ours obeys precise physical laws, but it may be that the type of rationality and coherence that they allow us to induce in the universe is strictly linked to the extraordinary simplification of this universe. Then, today, the important would be to delocalize the hypotheses and redeploy them at the level of the holistic of the whole, where they radically challenge our principles of materiality, of reality, and of rationality. Of course, I'm well aware that this is metaphoric, but we are not here about one more truth. We are trying to recover the traces of the illusion, that is to say, of the original crime that started with the elimination of antimatter, against the negation of all negativity, against the liquidation of evil, the extermination even of death, in order to recover a world completely positive, rational and true, which is the program of a perfect crime. I'm trying to suggest a certain illusionism in the full dynamic sense of the word. Against this perfect crime, against this artificial paradise of technicity and virtuality, we must recover the traces of the criminal imperfection of the world, that is, of its definitive enigmaticity. But are we ready to assume this paradoxical, catastrophic and ironic game that this objective illusionism proposes? This would mean a drastic revision not only of the principle of reality, but moreover of the principle of knowledge. Knowledge, in fact, assumes a kind of distance, a dialectic between subject and object, and a dimension of representation, where the subject is supposed to rule over the game, since he constructs the frame of representation and projects it into a world in order to deal with it rationally. All this presupposes a privileged subject position and the object's inferior status, including the scientific object. In the illusionistic perspective mentioned above, on the other hand, knowledge becomes metaphysically impossible, mastering neither appearance nor illusion. If this very equilibrium of principle and postulates is upset, knowledge is no longer possible in classical, rational, or logical terms. But this impossibility is not only metaphysical. Today, all the microsciences have reached the stage where the object no longer has a definite status. The object is no longer what it was. It vanishes and escapes in every domain. Elusive, evasive, it appears but in the form of ephemeral and aleatory traces on the screens of virtualization. In their extreme experimentation, the most advanced sciences can only verify the disappearance of the object, not its inexistence, but its playing with objectivity. From this illusionistic point of view, we have to do with a kind of revenge of the object, a type of play, strategy of dispersion. Virtualized even before disappearing, it seems to be a trickster, to trick all the protocols of a subject's experiment so that finally the subject loses his own position as subject. It's no longer possible in this sense to maintain the traditional dimension of the theory of knowledge. Basically, science constructs a scenario by presupposing the possibility of deciphering the world through the progress of analysis and techniques. And thanks to science, we actually discover the world in all its dimensions. We discover things, objects, atoms, particles, molecules, viruses, and so on. But never has science postulated as an eventual alternative that things discover us at the same time that we discover them, and that there would be an inexorable reversibility of the process. We have always thought that things were passively waiting to be discovered, like America by Columbus. But it's not the case. At the moment when the subject discovers this object, whether it's the virus or the Indians or whatever, the object makes a corresponding and reversible but never innocent discovery of the subject. It's a sort of revenge of the discovered object, maybe the invention of a subject by the invented object. Our traditional vision is based on the belief that knowledge proceeds always in the same direction from subject to the object. Well, the direction begins to reverse itself and initiate everywhere processes of reversion, be it in anthropology, in science, in viral pathology, and so on. It's very exciting. It seems that we have torn the object from its opaque and inoffensive stillness, from its indifference, from the profound secret in which it was occulted. And today, under our eyes, the enigma of the world and of the objects wakes up, determined to struggle to keep its secrets. We must not believe that we can rule over the world by unveiling the secret of things. The duel engaged between the subject and object signifies the loss of a subject's hegemonic position. It makes of the object the very origin of the subject's disappearance. Obviously, this new dramaturgy is opposed to the classic theory of knowledge. Reality itself becomes problematic through its very conformism. Servile and obsequious, reality bends to every hypothesis and verifies them all, the negative and the positive. Indifferent to every truth, it doesn't care about the knowledge that we are storing about it from its observation and analysis. All that is for it a provisional and superficial inspection. Here, reality intervenes like a sphinx. Reality itself becomes enigmatic and simulating. But the unintelligibility of it is not mystic nor romantic, is rather ironic. The paroxystic stage of a system usually coincides with its parodic stage. Irony is the last sign that comes from the secret core of the object, the pure, however indirect expression of reversibility of things. Here again, it's not a question of romantic or subjective irony, but of an objective irony linked to the radical material illusion of the world. Things have been so accelerated that processes are no longer inscribed in a linear temporality, in a linear unfolding of history. Nothing moves any longer from cause to effect. All causality is neutralized, transversalized by inversions of meaning, perverse events, ironic reversals. In the stream of accelerations, things enter into incredible turbulences, into self-potentialization as in chaotic effects. And this deregulation of the system is actually the work of the system itself. Just as Marx said of the proletariat that its emancipation must be the work of the proletariat itself, today we can say that the destabilization of a system is the work of the system itself. The system is the operator of its own annihilation. Pushed to an extreme sophistication, the systems implode by themselves, by an effect that has nothing to do with the action of any critical subject coming from outside to subvert or destroy it. This type of critical action still belongs to the era when we believed that life could be changed by changing the systems. Today we are dealing with a process of achievement, of ultra-realization, I would say, and automatic reversal. This I call objective irony. This probability, this very fatality of a system, that the more they advance toward their own perfection, the more they deconstruct themselves. This logic is at work in all religious, scientific, economic and political systems, as much as in material production and information. The excess of information, we said already, short-circuits itself, telescopes to a point where nothing is left. Saturated by media, we no longer deal with any real information, with any historic event. And the same with modern science. The more the object is hunted down to the extreme by experimental procedures, the more it invents strategies of counterfeit, evasion, disguise, disappearance. It's like a virus. It escapes indefinitely by inventing versatile counter-strategies. We must enjoy the irony of that, insofar as it breaks our hegemony and the foolish pretension of a subject to impose laws to the world, for even physical laws are the subject imposition of the world. But when the universe begins to disobey these laws, this dissidence becomes paradoxical and ironic. No critical thought of the rationalist type, no logic of cause and effect can face such phenomena. But I do not attempt to transform the object into a super-subject. But it happens as if something definitively escaped us. And I stress it definitively, for it is not the case that things escape because our science and technologies would not be yet advanced far enough. Just the contrary. The more we perfect the protocols of experimentation, the more the object steals away and finally becomes undecidable. And don't ask where it has gone. Simply the object is what escapes the subject. We cannot say anything else. We cannot go beyond, since our position is still that of the subject and of rational discourse. How can we do otherwise? Anyway, we can no longer allege an insufficient development of our scientific, intellectual, and or mental apparatus. For this apparatus has given all that it could give. It has even passed beyond its own rationality. I cannot tell you exactly in terms of seconds the decimal point of Planck's constant beyond which there will never be any possible knowledge of the cosmos in the first millionth second after the Big Bang. That is a definitively foreclosed issue. There light doesn't exist, there the universe is opaque, Planck's constant absolute. No representation is possible. This part is not even repressed or hidden. It's a definitive origin of events in the physical sense of the world, that is, beyond which nothing makes sense. Metaphorically, it may be said that at the core of every human being and everything, there is such a definitively inaccessible secret. This is the vital illusion that Nietzsche spoke about, the glass wall of truth and knowledge. From our rational point of view, all this may appear rather disparate, and could even justify something like pessimism. But from the point of view of singularity, of otherness, of the secret of seduction, on the contrary, it's our last chance. In this respect, The Perfect Crime is a book of radiant optimism. By way of conclusion, I would like to quote a very mysterious phrase of Heidegger. When we look into the ambiguous essence of technology, we behold the constellation, the stellar chaos, the stellar moving of a secret. This proposition has no referential value, but rather an enigmatic one, insofar as it refutes the very conception by Heidegger himself of technique and technologies as a loss of being, as contributing to the destruction of a secret, to the definitive unveiling of a secret, to total visibility and absolute identification, in other words, to the perfect crime itself. In this sense, technique would be, as Hegel said, the moving life of what is dead, a sort of negative ontology. This would be that at the extreme horizon of development of technique, perhaps something other happens, a reversibility, the emergence of another game with other rules, somehow completely ironic and pataphysical. Pataphysical means neither physical nor metaphysical, but pataphysical. At the end of an extraordinary adventure conceived to exterminate it, the constellation of secrets still resists and is alive. Both hypotheses are valuable, and there is no possibility of choice. Either we can think of technique as the exterminator of being, of secret, of seduction, of appearances, or we imagine by maybe an immense detour towards the radical illusion of the world. Then this detour, this technical cleanement, so to say, would be the specific and original feature and strategy of our culture. Then other culture, primitive culture before, developed other strategies of illusion, but we don't speak about it. Ours would be a strategy moving through all our technologies toward our own disappearance. But a disappearance opening a free space for an absolute event, absolutely imprevisible, that would finally bring us beyond of metaphysics, but in a different way of Heidegger, for whom technique is still the absolute achievement of metaphysics. The crucial point, but we don't know about that, I must confess, we don't know about this virtual end of things, of course. The crucial point is to go to the limit of hypotheses and processes, even if they are catastrophic. And I think it's no other justification for thinking and writing but to accelerate these terminal processes. Being always conscious that at the extreme of all possible theory, we shall have to do with two antinomic hypotheses. Here is the poetic and enigmatic value of thinking, for facing a world that has been given to us unintelligible and problematic. The task of radical thinking would certainly be to make it even more unintelligible and more enigmatic. Thank you very much.